We almost didn't see the prologue for Lord of the Rings. From the very beginning, Peter knew that he needed a prologue and that he wanted a prologue. And so he went to New Line Cinema and said, hey, can we do a prologue? And New Line Cinema said, you can have a prologue at the beginning of the movie, but it has to be 2 minutes long. And Peter and his team were like, are you crazy? We cannot do the backstory for the entirety of Lord of the Rings in 2 minutes. So Peter went back to New Line Cinema and asked them if he could do 7 minutes instead. And after they thought about it for a little bit, New Line said yes. Like with a lot of things Peter Jackson suggested, which he was very grateful for. Peter Jackson was very grateful that New Line Cinema would let him do the things he wanted to do, and that they were very willing to let him try things. Now that they know how long they have for the prologue, they can actually work on putting things to paper and figuring out what is actually going to be on screen. The very first draft of the prologue was written by Philippa Boyens in one go. She just sat down and she wrote it out, and they had the basic outline for the prologue. They wrote some stuff, they storyboarded, they prevised, and then they shot almost everything that they planned for the prologue. Started editing it together, and it just didn't work. It wasn't meshing and it wasn't flowing as they were hoping it was going to. One of the issues they were having was the voiceover for the prologue. Initially, they were having Frodo read the prologue, but it wasn't working. Mainly because he wasn't alive then, and he would have just been told things or read things, and so it didn't feel right. So instead, they switched to having Gandalf read the prologue. And that still didn't feel totally right, because Gandalf wasn't there at that time. Yes, he would have talked to people, read things, be super knowledgeable about that time, but he wasn't actually there. Also, you can listen to Gandalf's version in the the Lord of the Rings The Third Age game. And then they ended up choosing Galadriel, because Cate Blanchett has this incredible earthreal but also haunting voice, and Galadriel is there at that time, but also Galadriel is the one who ends the story of the rings in Return of the King.
The power of the three rings is ended. The time has come for the dominion of men.
And this way, by having her read the prologue, she is the one starting the ring story, as well as ending it. So it has this nice little bookend for the entire trilogy. They kept working on the prologue, kept not feeling totally right, kind of dropped it for a bit, and then they just threw what they had of the prologue back in when they were scoring the film and getting the soundtrack done. But then in the newest cut that they sent to New Line to have them watch, they left the prologue out, because it wasn't done, and they weren't sure if they were actually going to use it. After New Line watched that cut of the film, they came back and said, you guys need to have a prologue. And at this point in time, Peter and Fran are in London working on the final post-production of the film, because it's only a couple weeks out from being released. And so John Gilbert, the editor, grabs all the reels for the prologue, flies to England, and sets up a editing bay in Peter and Fran's house that they've rented in London, and they grind out the prologue. And the cut that they made in that rented house is basically the cut that is in the final film. The main problem they were having with the prologue was whose point of view were they going to tell it from? Whose perspective is this story happening from? They tried telling it from Isildur's perspective, Elrond's, just a kind of like third-person, earthreal view. None of the perspectives were working. And then when it started working is because they realized the ring is also a character in that time frame. They knew the ring was a character in the story, and they'd used that already in different parts of the film, but they'd forgotten that the ring could also be a character in the prologue. And so the prologue is told from the perspective of the ring. Here are just some details that I think are pretty fun. They decided to leave out a bunch of the place names and people names in the prologue because they felt like they were shooting the audience with a fire hose already, and they didn't want to increase the pressure. Ian Holm, they made him look younger by just taping his cheeks up. The Lord of the Rings logo at the very beginning of the film was thrown together in the last 3 weeks by Sasha Lee, who was a Weta Digital designer, and Alan Lee. And then Sasha Lee is also the one who came up with the title cards, like the blue letters. Alan Lee is one of the 9 kings at the very beginning of the film. Sauron was a very important piece of the prologue. They needed him to be super scary, they needed him to be powerful, they needed to have Sauron be this foreboding presence. They needed the audience to believe that Sauron was an actual threat, otherwise he wouldn't be able to be an overarching evil for the entire trilogy. And so they needed to sell that Sauron was this super dangerous character. And part of that was his design. They needed him to seem like super ancient, super powerful, and so the helmet was designed off of the skull of a horse. They used the sounds of airplanes and giant metal ships to get the sounds of Sauron as he's moving around. The armor, they did a bunch of acid etching, which took a really long time, but also gives his armor this like super intricate and detailed look to it. The finger that is cut from Sauron's hand, they originally tried to make it from charcoal and gunpowder because they're going to light the gunpowder and it would be burning as it crumbled apart, but it didn't really work that well, and so they ended up just making it out of charcoal, which I still think looks incredible to this day. Among the things that were storyboarded into the prologue that didn't make it into the final film was you were going to see how Sauron created the ring, which they actually filmed that. You can still see the knife in his hands in the final cut of the film. And then you are also going to see Sauron kill Gil-galad, which would explain a lot of things for people who go, why is Sauron reaching for Isildur? Why doesn't he just hit him with the mace? Well, guess how he kills Gil-galad? He grabs him and burns him to a crisp using his bare hands. Well, not his bare hands because he's wearing armor. But that's what happens in the books too. So there's your reason for why he reaches for Isildur. He just wants to fry him into ash. The dwarves receiving their rings shot is the well in the Moria set. That's what they're standing around. The shot of Gollum's cave, where Gollum's being creepy as always. Gollum is the only CG element in that shot. Everything else is kit-bashed miniatures from other sets. Also, cool detail in this, if you haven't noticed, you hear Gollum say Gollum and his reaction to hearing his other voice or whatever, which is just a really cool, fun detail. The One Ring was made by Jens Hansen, a local ring maker in New Zealand. They'd been trying to pick a design for the ring. They knew what the book described the ring as, but they needed something more specific when they went to ask somebody to make it. And they ended up choosing a modified version of Rick Porras. I hope I said that right. He was one of the co-producers for the film. They chose to make something that looked like his wedding band. And they went to Jens Hansen, and they asked him if he would do it for the films. And he said no, he wasn't that interested. He didn't want to do it. And that night he went home and talked to his sons about what had happened that day. He told them, hey, some people came. They're talking to me about this movie called Lord of the Rings. His sons were like, Dad, you gotta do this. You gotta do this. And explained everything about Lord of the Rings to him. And he called them back the next day and said, I'll do it. So Jens Hansen made the rings for the films. Sadly, he passed away before they were released. The main difference in the beginning of the films between extended edition and theatrical edition is the introduction to the hobbits. They had to cut down the intro of the hobbits for the theatrical edition quite a bit because they needed the full runtime of the prologue. And then last fun thing that I think is kind of cool. If they never had the prologue, if we'd never actually seen the prologue, the beginning of the film would have been the fade in on Bag End. Seeing the map of Middle-earth, into Bag End, down into the study with Bilbo. Which I think could have been a great opening. I much prefer having the prologue, but as somebody who's read the books a bunch, having the film start on the map of Middle-earth, going into Bilbo's study, would have also been incredibly magical. There's some behind the scenes stuff that you may or may not have known about the prologue. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Really quick, 2 things that I forgot to share. One, where they filmed the battle scenes for the prologue, they got permission to film there, but they also had to stay away from this special moss that's growing in that area. So they had to watch where they were stepping.
I've seen people going to war and then they're dodging moss instead of thinking about going to war. So
The second thing is that all of the chainmail in the movie was made by 2 guys working at a workshop. They set up this machine that would cut this tiny tube of plastic into tiny little rings that they could make chainmail out of, and it would still look pretty good on camera. And that little machine, over the course of 3.5 years, cut over 12.5 million rings. And over that same course of time, those 2 guys made set after set after set of chainmail out of these little rings. They also made a few of the hero versions of chainmail, the actual metal chainmail. So, props to these guys.